Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth, and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it to X. So, before I get into my first X, I do have to give the disclaimer that we are getting to the part of the alphabet where it's getting quite a bit harder, and my letters are getting quite a bit more tenuous. Okay, so my first X is Xmas. You can already see it at work. And I have checked, and this episode will air in September, which is coming up for Christmas, but obviously not actually Christmas, so I apologise. So I've gone with medicinal things that we mentally associate with Christmas. So starting off with mistletoe, quite festively speaking, mistletoe is a parasitic plant. Woohoo, spirit of Christmas. This means that, technically speaking, it is a bush which grows hanging from other trees. So it literally parasites off other trees when it grows. So mistletoe has long been associated with paganism and folk healing. It's used in quite a lot of fertility rituals and recipes. And it's really by the 18th century that it starts to become associated in people's minds with Christmas. But before then, it is very resolutely a medicinal plant or a healing plant. And another one, which again is, I'm sure, kind of in all our minds when we think about Christmas, is holly. So holly is also very strongly associated with folk rituals and folk medicine, and it was supposed to be able to protect you from malevolent forces. So it was a protective plant. Babies were bathed in water of holly to keep them safe. That was often a sort of ritual that was carried out. And in folk medicine, holly also had some more practical or physical attributes. And one was that holly was a diaphoretic, which means that it would bring about sweating. So this was often a way of treating fevers and infectious diseases. To bring sweating about was believed to bring the fever to a head. But it's also another example of humoral theory. So again, we've talked about this many, many times. Humoral theory being the idea that there are humors or these humoral fluids in the body that need to be kept in balance, and bad humors are removed. And people often particularly associate that with bleeding, with bloodletting. But there were lots of different ways that this could be done. And one of them was to make a person sweat, and then these sort of bad humors would sweat out of your body. So again, all tied into those very ancient ideas around medicine. So my next Christmas item is that when you think of the nativity scene, there are usually three items or three objects that you think of: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So all of those have a connection to medicine and were historically used as forms of treatment. So perhaps the more surprising one would be gold. Gold has medicinal uses in lots of different cultures. So in ancient China, it was used to treat infectious diseases and skin complaints. In the West, and well, actually in a few places, but including in the West, because gold is a very soft metal and quite malleable in comparison to other metals, it's quite often used in dentistry. And we know that that was the case at least back to ancient Greece, because a skull of a man from that period has been found, which his jaw was surgically repaired with gold thread. So it has a very long history. In medieval Europe, gold was added to tonics, particularly obviously of very wealthy people, of great rulers, with the idea that it could treat both melancholy and epilepsy. And this is my personal favorite use of gold. In European medicine, and well, in Arabic and early European medicine, it was used for a process known as gilding. And this just shows how rich and powerful some people were. They would typically coat their pills and their tablets in gold. And the idea was that medicines from that time period were often so unpleasant tasting. It was very, very difficult to take them. And also, if you were rich, you could just go, I don't want to taste things that are unpleasant. So you would wrap your pill in gold. It also made it easier to swallow. If a pill was very ragged or bumpy, it was quite difficult to swallow. So rich and powerful people would have their pills coated in a thin layer of gold. And of course, later on and into now, people will coat pills in gelatin or sugar or something like that. That really starts in the Victorian times. But yeah, if you were rich, then you would coat them in gold. The problem with coating something in gold was that, unlike gelatin or sugar, it doesn't dissolve. So what coating it in gold means is the pill will pass through you completely intact without your body absorbing any of the medicine that's in the pill. So great status symbol, but perhaps not that practical. And so the last couple of things I have is frankincense and myrrh. So I bunched these together because they are very similar to each other. So frankincense and myrrh are both resins, and they are both sourced in the same way by cutting a wound into a tree and then bleeding the gum and then collecting what comes out. So that's where both frankincense and myrrh come from. And we know from friend of the pod, the Ebers Papyrus. I feel like we're at a point now where the Ebers Papyrus probably is the friend of the pod.
Yeah. Inanimate object, but still, yeah.
Yes, but still. That both were in use about 1500 BCE, and they were, again, used for somewhat similar things. So they were used to treat wounds and sores on the bodies, but also they were both used as part of the mummification process. Although sometimes when we go through these, we've talked about so many things being part of the mummification process that I'm sort of picturing it like a soup, kind of throw everything into, because every herb and plant seems to have been part of this process. But the number of things that both myrrh and frankincense were used for is vast. And part of that is definitely because they had a nice smell to them. So myrrh was used as a scented hair tonic. It was used as a soap. It was also used as a treatment for indigestion. Ancient Romans used it for sore muscles and battlefield wounds. And to the extent it was so prized or so valued that soldiers would often carry a vial of myrrh like a first aid kit. In case you got wounded in battle, you could just pull out your myrrh and apply it, in case of emergencies. But ultimately, the nice thing about frankincense and myrrh is so many medicines were so unpleasant and horrible and had horrible side effects and also just tasted and smelt disgusting, that wasn't it nice to have something that didn't do anything really awful to you and actually tasted and smelt nice? What's your X then, Olivia?
I feel like it's perhaps the most obvious X. I've gone for X-rays. And it's one of those ones where it is a huge topic. So I've mostly focused just on the discovery of X-rays in that initial period, just after their discovery. But I'll start at the beginning. An X-ray is a form of high-energy electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength shorter than those of ultraviolet rays and longer than those of gamma rays. X-rays also provide the oldest and most frequently used form of medical imaging, also known as radiographs. High-energy waves such as X-rays and gamma rays are transmitted through body tissues with very little absorption. This makes them ideal for internal imaging. X-rays are absorbed by dense structures like bones, and so they're often used to help diagnose fractures, look for injury, or infection. They were discovered in 1895, which doesn't seem long enough ago, by the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen. I'm going to call him Röntgen. His name's going to appear a lot, so hopefully I've not butchered that pronunciation. And because he discovered them, X-rays are also known in many languages as Röntgen radiation. His discovery was actually entirely accidental. He was experimenting with cathode ray tubes at the University of Würzburg, and he noticed that the radiation emitted by the tube could pass through matter, creating a shadow-like image on a nearby fluorescent screen, and that the image revealed bones but not flesh. This led him to discover a new type of radiation, which he named X-rays. He also documented the first radiograph, or X-ray image, which was his wife's hand, showing the bones of her hand and the ring of her finger. This image became one of the most famous early X-ray photographs and demonstrated the potential of X-rays for non-invasive internal imaging. Röntgen immediately understood that X-rays could have medical applications, and following his discovery in January 1896, he sent a letter publicizing these X-rays to various physicians he knew around Europe. He chose not to patent his discovery, believing that widespread use and benefits shouldn't be limited by navigating patents and costs, and his groundbreaking work earned him the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. Now, X-rays are ubiquitous almost. I'm amazed that 1895 isn't that long ago. Prior to X-rays, things like broken bones, tumours, or a swallowed object couldn't be diagnosed or found without surgery. The sudden ability to see inside the human body had a huge impact on both medicine and society more generally. And because the equipment necessary to make an X-ray machine was cheap and the device was easy to use, X-ray machines were soon found in numerous locations, both medical and non-medical. So I know we've talked before about cure-alls and a kind of mania that comes when there's a new thing. X-rays aren't any different. Some historians refer to the X-ray craze of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where there was widespread public fascination and enthusiasm for X-rays, and that led to a variety of applications. X-rays also appeared in songs, poems, and advertising. Some early commercial uses of X-rays were pretty widespread and unrestrained. I have some examples. Photography studios offered X-ray portraits. X-ray imaging was an attraction at traveling shows, exhibitions, and lectures, where the ability to sort of see through objects was showcased by imaging someone's purse or someone's hand. The public also attributed various properties to X-rays, including germicidal and beautifying effects. They were used as a cure-all for headaches, mastitis, and something which we have mentioned before, I think on the episode about hair, that they were used in depilatory treatments. Cosmetic X-ray clinics were set up both in the US and France. X-rays were also used to inspect materials for flaws or cracks in industrial radiography, used by various industries to ensure the quality and safety of products such as tire manufacturing and pharmaceuticals. And shoe stores offered X-rays so that customers could see the bones in their feet. I've found several references to a coin-operated footoscope, which was a fluoroscope for fitting shoes, which emerged in the 1920s, and people continued using them until after World War II. But not everyone was impressed by X-rays. One writer in London's Pall Mall Gazette wrote that you can see other people's bones with the naked eye and also see through 8 inches of solid wood. On the revolting indecency of this, there is no need to dwell.
That feels very Victorian, doesn't it? It's revolting indecency. Oh.
Shocking. But the first documented use of X-rays in medicine occurred shortly after Röntgen's discovery. Dr. John Hall Edwards, who was a British physician, used them to examine bone fractures. In 1896, he began using X-rays under clinical conditions when he radiographed the hand of an associate, revealing a sterilized needle beneath the skin's surface. He also took the first radiograph to direct a surgical operation, the first X-ray of the human spine, and used X-rays to study a patient with a fractured skull. So the sort of medical and clinical use of the X-ray flourished pretty early on, but the dangers of prolonged X-ray exposure weren't fully understood, and the harmful effects of radiation were overlooked. So early X-ray machines produced high doses of radiation, which led to potential side effects for both the patients and the staff using the machines. In the early days of X-rays, they were sometimes used to treat medical conditions such as cancer although that practice was eventually discontinued once the long-term effects of radiation exposure, including skin burns and increased cancer risk, became evident. There were increasing concerns about burns in particular, which were termed X-ray dermatitis, and people who had been highly exposed to the rays soon began getting sick. By 1910, many of the photographers and radiologists who had helped popularize the technology had developed cancer, suffered amputations, or died. John Hall Edwards wrote papers and gave public addresses on the dangers of X-rays, having lost his left arm to exposure-related cancer. His left arm had to be amputated at the elbow in 1908, and 4 fingers on his right arm soon thereafter, leaving only a thumb. His left hand is actually in the Birmingham University Museum as a specimen to demonstrate the effects of radiation. In 1936, the Röntgen Society of Germany unveiled the monument to the X-ray and radium martyrs of all nations in the grounds of St. George's Hospital in Hamburg. And the memorial commemorates all those who died due to their work with the use of radiation, especially X-rays in medicine. So as X-ray technology improved, so did the applications. We now have a far better understanding of the risks associated with X-ray radiation and have developed protocols to minimize unnecessary exposure. Science fiction stories and superhero comics that have X-ray vision as a supernatural ability to see through normally physically opaque objects, and normally at will. The most famous example being Superman, who can see both through walls to see the criminals hiding in buildings, but he can also see through Lois Lane's dress to see her underwear.
And that's what the Victorians were worried about.
It is what that guy that wrote in the Pall Mall Gazette, that's definitely what he was worried about. One of the reasons I bring it up is because there's a surprising amount of academic articles that discuss the plausibility of Superman's X-ray vision. Also, the first person to have X-ray vision in a comic book was actually a woman, Olga Mesmet, in the 1937's Spicy Mysteries. Other key figures, pretty famous people in terms of the development of X-rays. Firstly, Thomas Edison. He was a pretty early adopter of X-ray technology and explored various substances to see how they fluoresce when exposed to X-rays, particularly interested in creating a practical X-ray tube. And alongside his assistant Clarence Daly, he developed a prototype fluoroscope, also known as the Vitascope, which allowed doctors to see through the body. Sadly, Daly was also one of the first people to suffer fatal radiation poisoning due to prolonged exposure, and that led Edison to abandon his research. There's also William David Coolidge, who was an American physicist, and he invented the Coolidge tube in 1913. The Coolidge tube was a more efficient X-ray tube, allowed for a better control of X-ray generation, and significantly improved the quality of images produced. That innovation meant that X-ray machines became more reliable and safer to use and paved the way for diagnostic radiology as a professional field. And then also Marie Curie, which you can't really talk about X-rays without talking about Marie Curie. She worked extensively with X-rays during World War I, at a time where they gained popularity in military medicine. She and her colleagues developed mobile X-ray units called Petit Curies that could be used to treat wounded soldiers on the battlefield, locating bullet fragments and shrapnel and allowing surgeons to operate more accurately. She and her daughter, Irene, but it's French, so Irene, drove the first mobile X-ray unit to a battlefield in France in 1914, which marked the first time that X-rays were taken for medical use outside of a hospital. Curie was named director of the Red Cross Radiology Service in France and convinced the French government to set up the country's first military radiology centres, helping to get 200 X-ray machines into field hospitals. And it's estimated that over 1 million wounded soldiers received X-ray exams during the war.
So my second X is Xavier, brackets, St. Francis, close brackets. The reason why I have picked Xavier, brackets, St. Francis, close brackets, is because he was a saint, and he is someone who is particularly associated with his relics and how they were used, including how they were used for healing. I'm starting with him, but I'm using him to then talk about medicinal relics. But we've done R already, and I didn't do relics then, so I'm shoehorning in relics under X. So that's all my lengthy justification for how I've ended up with this topic. As I say, I'm specifically going to be talking about how his body was used after his death. But just to start off, Xavier was a Spanish Catholic missionary who lived in the 1500s and, amongst other things, established the first Christian mission in Japan. A lot happened to Xavier's body after he died, because he died out there, he didn't die back in Spain. Initially, after he died, he was buried on a beach in China. Then, 1 year later, his remains were dug up and reburied in Malaysia. Then, a month after that, his body was dug up again and taken by one of his colleagues back to the base, back to his home. 6 months after that, his body was shipped to India. And it's all right, there won't be a quiz at the end about all the different places he was buried. It's just to give you an idea of just how much his body was sort of messed with. And after it was shipped to India, it was placed in a glass coffin, which was inside a silver coffin. And all along the outside of the silver coffin were these very ornate silver panels, which depicted different events in Xavier's life. Momentous events like, when he allegedly miraculously cured people and that sort of thing. So his body remained in a church in India, although about 50 years later, an Italian priest removed Xavier's right forearm, and this was taken and displayed in a church in Rome. Another one of his arm bones was removed and put on display in China, and part of his right hand is on display, still on display today, in Sydney, Australia. And his right arm, the one that went to Rome, then in 2018 was taken on a grand tour of Canada. And that just gives you a bit of an idea about how much people were interested in relics. They were scavenging different bits of his body and taking them all over the world. So just to take a step back for a moment, the reason why people were so interested in getting a part of Xavier, these parts of his body were viewed as religious relics. So the word relic literally derives from the Latin word for remains. So it is, in this case, it is human remains. And a relic is part of the body of a saint or other significant person, or an object which has come into contact with their body. I'm specifically talking about Christianity here, but relics also play a role in other religions, Buddhism and Islam. But as I say, this is about Christianity. And also references to relics in different contexts in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. Catholic relics, like Xavier's, are or were often viewed as having particular properties. Different body parts of different saints could have different properties. So sometimes they were just generally healing, but sometimes a particular body part was known to be good for healing children or epileptics or lepers. And this goes right back to the Bible. So Old Testament, there is when a dead man is brought back to life by touching the bones of a prophet. And in the New Testament, when a woman is healed by touching the hem of Jesus Christ's robe. So there is a origin story. Relics could even go as simple as literal dust or dirt which had come from the grave of a saint. And relics were hugely important for local economies. They brought tourists to your town. Tourists would buy food. Tourists would look for somewhere to stay. They would buy souvenirs. They would go on pilgrimages. So it was sometimes quite cynically viewed by certain churches as something you wanted to get because it gave your church status and it brought in income. Relics were particularly popular in times of famine or of plague. They were viewed as potential, preventatives or protections. So there were sliding scales of relics. So at the very top were relics connected with Jesus and with Mary Magdalene. And then you have essentially 3 levels of relic. So you got your first level relic, which is an actual body part of a saint. You got your second level relic, which is something that's come into close contact with the body part. For example, their clothing, like the sandals of Jesus, or the girdle of Virgin Mary is one that comes up a lot. And then there is a third level relic. So if you were an ordinary person who didn't have a lot of wealth or status, there's no way you're getting the arm of a saint. But you could buy something that had sort of brushed against them. So there was a whole industry around, you can buy a piece of cloth that had been briefly placed on the remains, or a petal of a flower that had been placed on the remains, or even water which the relic had been dipped into. Those are not something that's finite in the same way that an actual relic is. You know, you could keep touching a piece of, different pieces of cloth against it, and therefore you could have this endless stream of relic objects for sale on that basis. And there was a lot of forgery because these objects were so popular. Every saint must have had at least half a dozen arms. At one point, there were 7 different foreskins of Jesus in circulation. So it's a huge industry around it. It really was a tourist trap of the sort of medieval, early modern period. People were able to venerate almost anything. I found a record at one point of St. Andrew's kneecaps being transported to Scotland and people being in awe of the kneecaps of a saint. There were also quite a few cases of theft. In the 12th century, a bishop was recorded as having bitten off part of Mary Magdalene's arm. In another case, a woman allegedly bit off one of the toes of Francis Xavier. Biting seemed to come up quite a lot. I think it's because perhaps it was spontaneous. People weren't planning on doing this, but in the moment they did. But there are quite a few cases of people biting off body parts of saints, sometimes to sell on, but there were definitely some cases where people were biting it off and swallowing it, presumably thinking that the healing property of the relic would be sort of absorbed into their body if they bit it off. There is a definite shift. So around the time of the Reformation, the church starts to move away from the idea that these relics have literal, actual healing powers. And then they become to be viewed by most people, not by everyone, as symbols rather than as literally mystical, magical objects. It doesn't entirely go away, and there are definitely some people who continue to go on pilgrimages with the idea that touching or even seeing one of these saints' relics will cure them of their disease. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.